Oh, thank you very much for the introduction. I was you were synthesizing that I have done better. I'm sorry. I was listening to you all the things that I have done, and it's like, when did I do all those things? So thank you so much. I appreciate that, and thank you for the opportunity for being here today to share about Latin American politics, especially from Latin American perspective. And I would say, especially from a South American perspective, an Ecuadorian perspective, which has been my main or the core of my political science studies. So I'm happy to be here with all of you and to share with you my analysis of the trends in the region, and also to start a conversation with you after my presentation. I want to say as well that English is my second language. So I would like to send my apologies in advance if I mispronounce some words or I do some grammar mistakes. I know that that can happen, so I just want to be aware and conscious of those things as well. So I call my presentation the 21st Century Socialism in Latin America, and that with a reference to the way of left-wing governments elected in Latin America since the 2000s. So I was thinking about the reasons why there's again this like a surge of left-wing governments in the Latin American region, especially in South America. Let's say this being Tide 2.0. And I was thinking about what are the main characteristics or features that remain from the first wave or the first side that they were assisting or allowing for the second one. And what the difference is between the first wave of left-wing governments in the region, and to allow this second one to exist or to rise now. So those questions I said to myself, and I invited to discussion and reflection. The second slide, please. Next.
The second?
The second.
Here we go.
Perfect. Thank you. So I have prepared these three presentations that I divided in three main parts. My ambition here today is to talk to you about from this macro structural perspective of the region, as I said at the beginning, specifically from the South American countries, to understand the flow of these tides since the 2000s. It's not my intention to analyze in depth any of those factors or to classify each of these countries into specific buckets, but to narrate and analytically describe the facts and start a conversation about that with all of you today. So the main three parts are a review of the Latin American's first wave of leftist government. The second one will be the rising big tide of 2.0 and some final remarks for us to discuss. Next, please. So here you can see the main leaders of the region that were well known since the 2000s. And on the other side, there is the map and how it was. The red remarks the left-wing governments between the period of time, the 2007 to 2012. And I think in the late 90s, this pink tide seeds were planted in the region. As the region moved away from dictatorships, regimes, the democracies that were emerging in the region from the left they were really much desired to appear. But the thing that happened in the late 90s was that these political and economic elites, better known as the caudillos in the region, were continuing to hold in the power. So the left-wing governments that appearing to the power at the beginning of the 2000s on the momentum of well-established social movements were charge with fostering positive changes in the area. It was led by these charismatic leaders, such as Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia, and Lula da Silva in Brazil, as well as Rafael Correa in Ecuador, who were known for their commitment to addressing social inequality and poverty in the region. So the question is, why were these left governments elected in the first so-called pink tide, which include almost all South American countries and their governments, as you can see in that map. And with some exceptions like Colombia and Peru, as well as several other countries in the Central American, like Salvador, Nicaragua. In most of the region, what happened was like the reason why they were elected and they were well accepted is like the most of the region, the neoliberal project of accumulation model simply couldn't deliver in terms of material goods as well as well-being for the masses of the population in these countries. So at the same time, I believe that these neoliberal regimes before these ones lost legitimacy as a result of their representative crisis of the political parties. And the vast majority of the people felt like not only were their livelihoods under threat, but that they have no say in politics and running these countries' governments. So as a result of these factors, resulted in a cycle of mobilizations, specifically in Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia, those two main countries, that the beginning in the late 20th century in Argentina, and later in Venezuela, and then later in Ecuador. They allow these kind of new left governments win elections in early 2000s. Next, please. Thank you. So during the first of the initial pink tide or wave of left-wing governments with similar ideologies, the first thing that they wanted to do is to drive this regional integration. Under the 21st century socialism, or what we can also call the 21st century populism in South American countries, there are some key features that are rising that could be identified across this region. So first, for example, are these social reforms or social welfare expansion. These governments have been committed to reversing these decades of growing inequality by expanding social provisions. So programs such as the Bolsa Familia in Brazil, or Bono Solidario in Ecuador, or the assignation of universal stipend for children in Argentina were very common social programs in these countries. Leaders in these countries were considered populists for emphasizing these redistributive promises in their political discourses, and they were lucky to meet all the social demands, given the earnings from the exports and raw materials that was like a boom, the commodity boom in the early 2000s. So these leftist governments, more as I said, in this South American region than in the rest of the Latin America, they took advantage of this commodity boom until around 2011, probably, while historically these high commodity prices have provided the left in power with fiscal room to maneuver and actually govern from the left. In the long run, this primary score model of accumulation was an impediment to achieving this 21st century socialism. So leftist governments have channeled revenues from extraction and export of primary commodities into this social spending and also infrastructure investment, resulting in a massive reductions in poverty, income inequality, and great strides in health and education outcomes, and other development outcomes such as regional integrations of these big forums like CELAC and UNASUR. We'll go to the next, please. Another
couple of key features is this relationship with informal and urban poor layers of these countries. This is also crucial from a political standpoint, because once elected, these left governments were able to follow through the campaign promises. Because it was one thing just to be elected and declare, we are going to pay our social debt, and then find yourself unable to do so, because they were under an austerity period, but there was the fate of the left-wing governments that came into power in the 80s or the 90s, but not for them. So having the means to follow through on their commitment is one thing, and actually having them is quite another, right? So this has made a significant difference. And this is one of the reasons why the left-wing governments, they were successful in securing as many electoral victories from the 2000s till the 2011, 12 in numerous countries in the region. Other key feature was that they were building new institutional foundations. They were creating new constituent assemblies, and they were rewriting new constitutions, and that allowed them to continue to govern for so long. So, for example, I was going to say an example of Ecuador. What I was wanting to emphasize, when they were writing constitutions, they were introducing the mechanism of direct democracy. So this allowed these presidents to emphasize this role of direct connection and direct appealing to the people, and circumvent the other powers in the region. So that allowed, in cases of Ecuador, to govern beyond some extension of time when they already lost the Congress, or they didn't have enough majority at the Congress. But everything changed from 2016, and this prolonged rule to mutually beneficial relationship with informal and urban poor layers and the country's working class was in decline. So a middle class pro-business party in Argentina was defeated by Cristina Fernandez, the Kirchner neo-Peronist administration, in what many have referred to as a constitutional coup. Dilma Rousseff, the successor of two-term president and founder of the Workers' Party, Lula da Silva, also known as Lula, was impeached. In Venezuela, Hugo Chavez chosen his successor, Nicolas Maduro, who survives the nation. And yeah, in Ecuador also we had, what was his name? Rafael Correa till 2015, and then 2017 was a change. So why did the first wave of left governments fail to implement the structural changes that they may have allowed them to break free from the cycle that led them to their own decline? Don't go to the next place. Yeah, so the falling of the leftist government, as you can see in the map from 2008 to 2018, how the color changed from this very pink tide to a more blue right-wing government. But this government only lasts for a period of 4 years, right? And the reasons why there was this decline of the leftist government, and also was a lack of support, of popular support, because the community boom by the end of the 2011-2012 was in decline as well. And there was a decline of regional integration because they didn't have the community, the incomes of these countries lacked these kind of regional organizations, forums, and the unstable migration flow in the region. And then these authoritarian tendencies as well, lack of democracy and the populist model of direct democracy, and then the commodity boom in decline. So it was an economic mismanagement for all these regions that allowed the right-wing governments to take place since 2017, 2018 in the South American region, as you can see in the map. We will go to the next, please. So once in power, the new right wing in these countries has mostly kept in the same social programs that the previous pink tie government had put into place, because since the constitutions were modified, these new right-wing governments didn't have the opportunity to change them, because when they got into power, they didn't have the majority in the Congress, so they couldn't manage to do amendments in the constitutions. So the pendulum was again trying to swing more to the left as a result of the electoral victories. Also, there was this the economic crisis, the end of commodity bonanza, the lack of responsiveness to the COVID-19 global pandemic, the new commodity boom. This is the rising big of today. Then there's sorry, I think I missed something. Yeah. Oh, no, we're okay. So, yeah. This is what I wanted to show you in this slide is like there was this new pink tide, right? The failure of the right-wing administrations, then there is a new commodity boom that is existing in the nation, but not coming from oil as it used to be in Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, but it's coming from other mineral resources. And then we have a new political context that it has less public support, not congressional majorities, but the context of increased volatility, but allow the new left governments to propose new political agendas. Can we go to the next? So looking at each one of these factors, the performance by country here in this map showed that during the 2019, the weaker export performance was observed in most of the region in the first quarter of the 2019. And also when it came into 2020, the pandemic, these new right-wing governments couldn't keep with responding in a proper manner to the pandemic, since they didn't have, or they didn't come with the same commodity boom than the first wave of the leftist countries, so they were failing. We'll go to the next, please. As well here you can see the new commodity boom is like here in the region, what is called the lithium triangle in Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, and also copper is the new commodity boom that allow the new pink tide 2.0. The new political context is the presidents came to power with a new political agenda, not supported by traditional parties, but by new parties and social organizations. They prioritize environmental and gender issues, as well as the fight against racism and discrimination against minorities in their programs. And they also advocate for more participatory democracy. Right now, all eyes are focused on Brazil, where former President Lula won elections again. And with Lula, Brazil will resume a more active policy in Latin America, and specifically in South America, supporting regional projects. Lula must also should recreate a Brazilian-Argentine cooperation, which has been lacking prior Bolsonaro elections. And in the next slide, I would like to show you how the transition from the pink tide to the second, or the pink tide 2.0. As you can see, by the end of 2008, the 70% of countries in South American region, as I show you in the first map, were from the left. And then you see the decline 2012 and 2016, but once again, it has climbed to the 7% of the countries in the region. So for me, it's clear that we are living or riding this pink tide 2.0 in the region, which is different, and I will show you the differences in the next slide, please. So in contrast to the first pink tide, this result in a level of scarcity rather than abundance. And you can see that the regionalization of the economy in both is low. The commodity price increase in both, but not in the same way, because it's not distributed in all the countries in the same, like some of the countries in the region has more than the others. And there's economic growth, but not as high as it was in the first pink tide. The competition of leadership, there is none in this Pink Tide 2.0, and the regional project is still heterogeneous. The regional institutionalization in both is very thin, and the international context, while in the first Pink Tide was very permissive, in the second is more restrictive. The interest in the United States and the first Pink Tide was very low, and in the second one is very high. The democratic consensus was medium by electoral democracy mainly during the first tide, especially because of the mechanism of direct democracy, and in the second is low. And there's regional governance, but and the first one was this aim to be more this cooperation between the countries, and now it's very fragmented. And final remarks, please, next one. So as final remarks, I would like to highlight that the Pink Tide has been a controversial phenomenon with both its supporters and critics. It has been characterized by progressive politics, increased social spending, and great regional integration, although it has been criticized for its authoritarian populist tendencies and economic mismanagement. Regarding some drawbacks in the region, the biggest one, in my opinion, was the inability to go beyond the general framework of a neoliberal market economy, because they show that the dependence on raw materials, natural resources, and foreign markets for these countries and contracts with major energy companies show that they didn't switch from a different kind of development models and the left had attempted to do across the region in the 60s and the 70s. And in my opinion, that is what this governance had the main flow. And I believe the cause is that they lack the social power to push in that direction by their supporters. And so yeah, that is the issue of the commodity dependency and how it has proved a double-edged sword for the Latin American, especially the South American countries. The nations that are passing up to the chances to create a political and economy multipolarity offers, and increasing trade with China only increase the region dependence on commodity exports rather than emphasizing regional integration to achieve economic autonomy. And the second remark that I want to say for the new leftist political agendas is that they were able to win these elections because they have this environment, gender issues, and diversity and inclusion as an agenda, as a main agendas to win the elections, to run the campaigns. And they were claiming for more participatory democracy from a different perspective than in the first Pink Tide. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your very interesting presentation. We're going to start blending as we did last week. Questions from the audience, questions from Zoom. I'll just start up so think of your questions. I'll circulate the room. Tim's going to be bringing to the group some questions from our Zoom audience. Maybe as we get questions going here, you could just comment a little bit about the spectacle in Brazil with former President Bolsonaro hanging out in outside of Disney World, and what that exactly is all about, and while at the same time, like you said, some interesting moves between Brazil and Argentina, talking about a possible shared currency, and just be interested to hear your comments on that. And then
Sure.
Raise your hand, and I'll circulate the room for those questions in the room. Yeah, go ahead.
I was thinking that I was waiting for other questions. Yeah, what just happened in Brazil? In my opinion, it was just a revolt that was well planned due to these kind of social media platforms that the people were organizing. But it's very difficult to say that Bolsonaro was behind them. And if he was, it was not intended to be a coup d'etat against Lula to overthrow him, but it was just intended to cause this revolt and to show the fragmentation in the country, of the population of the country. It was not, I know that the rules were a little bit violent and went to destroy this symbolic representation of the three powers of the country in Plano Alto. But still, I don't believe that was more than a revolt showing a disagreement that Lula won. And one of the phenomena that have been happening in the region is that the right-wing governments that took place for the since 2016 till 2020, is like they won the elections with little or small margins with the other candidates. So when they were trying to govern, the legitimacy was low, and the majority of the Congress of Parliaments was always fragmented. So they were not able to really do anything at all during those 4 years. So in the case of Brazil, people showing that up in the streets was not the intention to overthrow Lula, but just show them that not all the population is supporting his new government. But as well as in other countries in the region, the right-wing government didn't have the opportunity to show or to make difference because they didn't have this commodity boom to govern or to do more than the social or the welfare that the other ones did. So that is going on in Brazil. And then, Lula, we're expecting, I think the region is expecting his leadership in terms of doing more regional agreements, especially with Argentina, but it's not a priority, and it wasn't the first of the big tie that in the region, because Chiles, he had this idea that dates back in the Gran Colombia from the 1800s, where this Gran Colombia was a big project of Simón Bolívar to get united Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru. So he had that in his mind, and he wanted to consolidate the region in that way. But in this second of the Pink Tide 2.0, there is not that effort. So just probably between countries like Brazil, Argentina, Chile, will be this kind of agreements, but it will be in terms of only economical terms, because in terms of political terms, these countries are quite different.
Hey, a question for you on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The TPP was approved by the Chilean Congress this fall. It was certainly a very, very controversial issue here in the US. How has that affected some of the dialogue between the sort of elasticity between the right and the left? And is that seen as a positive step forward for the countries who are involved in the TPP?
A step forward to?
I mean, is there still tension about the approval and moving forward to be part of TPP? And was Chile's approval of this at all controversial?
Thank you for your question, Tim. And it will be like, I will divide the South into parts. In the Andean countries that are like in the northern part, and the other countries that are in the South, where is Chile, Argentina, and also Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay. That has been always there. So the tension will be there because this partnership will be among the southern countries of South America rather than in the northern countries of South America. And how that will affect the rest of the other countries is still unknown. But what I can tell is like countries like Ecuador, Venezuela, Peru, and Colombia, they struggle with their own things and being not part of I don't think that it will be an agreement and it will create more tension in the region. It's not seen as something that will create a consolidated region based on that, but it will also just emphasize this fragmentation because that is not a priority to create a regional project as this was in the Pink Tide 1.0, that is the 2.0 or Pink Tide that we are kind of seeing that is happening right now.
Great, we have another question in the room.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, you mentioned commodity exports, welfare payments and so on. I was wondering, is there any culture of entrepreneurship throughout South America. Has there been traditionally, is there now? Could an entrepreneur flourish? Could Elon Musk do well in South America?
That's a good question. And if I revise in my mind the history of South American countries, that never happened, because we were always these countries that relied on these big kind of main primary goods to export. And we were governed before from these political economic elites. And it's a region that is tend to be this oligopoly kind of economic way. So seeing the other way around, probably in countries like Argentina, Brazil, maybe, yeah, but it will always be separate from other countries. So when we talk about South America, Latin America, we can say that that could happen in countries like Argentina and Brazil, and those will be very relevant countries to analyze and present. But then if you're talking from a regional perspective, that will be hard to tell. I cannot see that happening, because the story here in South America has been a cycle, right? Going in, and then we're going back to the same point, one over and over. And sometimes I joke, I said, like in countries like Ecuador, nothing has been happening since the 1830s. Because it's always seemed the same. I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
But no, we're gonna.
Yeah, we're gonna take from,
sorry.
we're gonna alternate our questions
Sorry.
from online and in the audience. So it's a lovely thing that taking turns. So from and also when I ask a question, please address it to the
Oh, okay,
audience.
sure. Yeah.
I don't matter in this history.
Okay.
From your point of view, what role is Mexico and its President Obrador playing in South America?
Thank you, Tim. That's a good question. I think South American countries are looking to Mexico to be leading a new regional integration of the region, Central American region and South American region. But we still haven't seen that leadership from Mexico. So I don't see the big role that we are waiting from Mexico to show us as leading, that it has been like very visible lately. It's just playing one more left-wing part of this pink tide 2.0 in the region, but it has its own features and key characteristics that I don't know whether they will survive or they will do something for the region as a whole.
Okay, we have another question in the room here.
First, thank you very much for your talk and your perspective. I want to ask a question about Chile, which I think since the Pinochet regime has skewed more to the right. Now, obviously, in the last year, there's been a socialist government elected, and yet the Constitutional Convention, that product failed. Does that represent a limit to Big Tie 2, or is Chile just an outlier in this model?
Well, Chile, it has been always an outlier since the 2000s. But right now, the fact that the new constitution couldn't be approved when the people were called to elect yes or no, if they approved that, reveals one of the features of this pink tide 2.0, which is that the presidents, the new left-wing presidents that are leading right now these countries, they don't have this big mass support as the one that they had before. So they are here governing these countries from the left wing with less support compared to the pink tide 1.0 that we have. And that is because we have this break of these right-wing left parties, right? And this new pink tide is in place, is not because of the same reasons that the first one, but it's because of the new commodity boom that is in the region, specifically in Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina. And also because the bad performance or the failure of the right-wing governments from the 2016 till the early 2021. So it is part of it as well, yeah.
So another question from online.
Sure.
With the social unrest happening in Peru, what is the probability that this will widen and spread to other countries?
Yeah. I'm thinking about the region and it's amazing. I'm always laughing when I'm reading the news or talking with colleagues because it's like, it's so fun to know about South American politics. There's always something fun happening. And I'm saying this, it's like, yeah, you cannot get, I don't know, there's always something fun. And I like to analyze country by country because being from Latin America and from Ecuador, there's a lot of features and factors that are very particular for each country. So trying to generalize or put all these countries into a bucket is complicated. So in the case of Peru, I'm not sure, and I don't think that what is happening, the revolt that happened, and how the president tried to just eliminate the Congress and just be the dictatorship of the country could be contagious to other countries in the region. Because, for example, in Ecuador, that is the near or the close neighbor, that cannot happen because of the constitution, how it was made in 2008 in Ecuador, that kind of ban all these manifestations on the streets that could overthrow any president, and also give powers, extremely strong powers to the executive offices. So trying to do that in Ecuador will be harder than it has been in Peru. So it will depend on the case, but I don't think that will happen in other countries. Brazil could be like one example of a similar revolt on the streets, but I think that Brazil was, how can I say, or it looks like it was a very spontaneous revolt. But I don't think that will happen what happened in Peru in other countries, so.
Thank you. Question in the room.
Yes, one of the things that confused me about the reading, which I thought was very complicated, and he tries to put things into buckets, which you don't want to do. So I'm going to ask you a bucket question.
Please go ahead.
I understand the dictatorships,
Yeah.
and I understand the countries that are trying to be social democracies like Europe. But the other one, I think he calls them populist governments. I'm not quite sure. But to me, I don't quite understand what is the distinction between, and he called them left populist. But can you help me with that?
I'll try, sure. And I call it 21st century populism because in the region we have had the classic populism in the 30s. We have had the neo-populism in the 90s, early 2000s, and since all these left-wing governments were happening, we call it the 21st century populism. And what is the difference between, and that's why I don't like to put it into buckets, because I think all the South American countries experience some, at certain point, dictatorships, authoritarian regimes. All of them went through this aim to introduce social democracy as a new way to see the governments with providing more safety nets for the poor population that we have always had. But populists have been there forever in the region. And the difference is like, since we have these presidential regimes with a multi-party systems competing in elections, we tend to have these very strong, charismatic leaders that really emphasize in their discourses that they represent the people. And the people is always the poor people. And when they get to this, when they win the elections and get in office, the first thing that they do is promise that they will change that situation, that they will provide the poor what the rich are taking away from them. So it's always this dichotomy between the good and the bad, and they represent the good in terms of the discourse. And what happened in Latin America during this first being tried is like they had the money from this commodity boom to do that, to do these kind of social programs, to give this extra money or stipends to the poor people in the region. They had the money to build schools, to new infrastructures for these kind of regions that were always excluded from the other previous governments in the regions. So that's why they are left or 20% populist, but they had the opportunity to really fulfill all the promises that they were saying in their discourses. So it was not only the discourse, it was not only this very charismatic and leader, but they were always doing populist through the social policies that they were implemented. Plus, these governments were introducing the mechanism of direct democracy, and by doing so, they were appealing to this direct contact with the people through elections. So if I want to ask them something, I will call for a popular consultation, for a plebiscite. And also I will open the recall referendum for anyone just if they don't like me as a president, to call for to overthrow me, but not on the street, but during this formal institutionalized process of a recall referendum. But that was allowed them to circumvent other powers like the Congress. If they don't want to approve a policy, they went through to a popular consultation or a plebiscite to change or approve something. So they use this mechanism as well to solidify or consolidate this populist left-wing or 21st century populism in the region. So I don't know if I answered your question. It helps. Yeah. But I think all of the left-wing governments, presidents leading these countries are populist in a way, whether they like it or not. So it's always there. And it's for me is endemic from this kind of presidentialist system that we have in the region and the way that we elect presidents. It's cultural as well.
So one of the things we've seen happen over the recent years has been a return to great powers rhetoric in terms of competition. And China is certainly a country that we've been looking a lot at. We're looking at their investment in Africa, but increasingly more their investment in South America. How is that sort of investment and increased trade with China affecting politics in Latin America?
When this first wave of leftist government started in 2000 with Chiles leading this regional integration, they interested to get in with the US as the main international partner was in decline. So China came as a big kind of player for all of us. So all the investments that China were doing in countries like Ecuador and Peru and Bolivia as well, with these huge, big infrastructural projects, how these South American countries were going to pay that back to China was in the future with our oil extraction from the future. So it has affected a lot because in countries like Ecuador, we still own China. I don't know for how many more years, probably another decade or two from the investments that they did back in the 2007-8, that the new governments that are taking the lead in these countries, they cannot read on that previous commitments from the first wave of leftist governments in the region. So China will be present in the region for at least a couple more decades.
Okay, question in the room?
Thank you for your presentation. I want to dig a little deeper into the rejection of the Constitution in Chile, because it was not only a rejection, it was an overwhelming rejection. So part of it is there to explore the tensions within the left, within South America. And I'm not talking about processes like revolution versus election, but approaches. And you had a tension within Chile between those people who probably voted for the current president, who believed in social economic equality and solidarity, and had the criticisms of like Stiglitz on the IMF and austerity program, versus a kind of new left that was concerned with cultural rights and LGBT rights, and a whole series of specifically enumerated rights that were in that constitution. And I wonder if you could talk about that tension between those elements of it. That's my phone. I apologize. I don't know what it is. And the second part of that is, what do you do when you have the left disagreeing over how to approach indigenous groups? You have one group that believes in social and economic equality and wants to integrate and include those groups. And then you have the group, often the groups themselves, who talk less in those terms, but more in terms of autonomy.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Very complicated, multi-layer question, multi-dimensional answer for that question. But yeah, the situation in Chile, I think, and I'm forgetting his last name of the president. But in Chile, the attempt to redo the constitution date back from Bachelet's government. So it was something that was discussed before. Something was that the people in Chile wanted before. So that was kind of in a transformation during Bachelet government until this last government. And finally that happened. And I think was one of the platforms that made this new president won the elections at the first place, because it was one of the, in his campaign was of the things that he was offering. But then, of course, culturally, to understand how this evolved within a country like Chile that has been a very conservative country, probably the most conservative country, as I said before, like an outlier in the region, to change those big environmental, gender, etc. issues and put them within a constitution to be approved, it takes a lot of support that he didn't have. Not only support, like the citizens believing that he will be a new leader of the country, but mass support coming from political parties to move the basis of the population, to support those kind of modifications, change or amendments as a whole. It represented the constitution. And that is something that happened if we went to compare with countries like Bolivia and Ecuador, when they included in the constitutions the rights for the nature, to respect those rights. That was approved immediately because those two governments were supported by social movements from the indigenous communities. So it was not difficult to understand that those kind of ones, because it was a strike for the rest of the population, like, oh, we're taking into account the rights of the nature here. So to respect the Pachamama in Ecuador and Bolivia, and it's like, that was super surprising for most of the citizens that we accept that at once. Or the indigenous justice is always also in the constitution of Bolivia and Ecuador, because we are these two countries with big indigenous populations. So that's why we took it into account. So, but in Chile, they didn't have this kind of mass support for the values that he was trying to introduce at the constitutional level. So that's why it was the big failure. It was not saying against him, but it was something like culturally, the people was not ready to approve within a constitution. And as you mentioned, they want this change of economic model to something most likely the social democracy or more center left, that right that they have been used to. But yeah, and the other question was about the indigenous population.
Often the indigenous populations are asking for autonomy rather than complete inclusion and equality, social and economic.
Yeah, they want to be part of the government. They want to govern together with the other elites that are leading the government. And in these two countries that has, like I said, Bolivia and Ecuador, they have different stories, right? And in Ecuador, the indigenous social movement that supported Rafael Correa since 2017 to 2014, when it was part of the government, it kind of lost the values of the indigenous communities as well, and it started to play this political dynamic as well as the other political parties. But the difference with the Bolivia is like Evo Morales was the elections with a political party that was already supported by the indigenous people. So it was not creating any political party to take him to win the elections, but he was supported by the political party that was there. In Ecuador, Rafael Correa created a new political party that was supported for the social movements of the indigenous people. So it was two different processes to include indigenous peoples within the government. And we can see the differences. Bolivia was more successful than Ecuador in doing so because the indigenous people were really leading and governing the country, when the thing that didn't happen in Ecuador. So, yeah, more of the idea.
So we're coming up to the end of our time. I've got one more question. When we consider global affairs and great decisions, we must always take in the good and the bad. And the fulcrum there is often hope. So what countries in Latin America do you have the most hope for in terms of economic and democratic success?
I have always think that this kind of connection of system dynamic between the political sphere and the economic sphere, like you don't know or you don't get to differentiate in which moment, at what time, and how, which one is leading the other one, right? So it's very, very hard to tell, but was kind of very visible during this, the 2000s until now, the last 2 decades, to see that the economic dynamic, the economic sphere was leading the political sphere, right? As I tried to explain that, the left-wing governments from this first wave of they were successful because of that. They come with this community boom that allowed them to fulfill their promises. So thinking about this economic perspective and how we can see these countries in the region not only be successful from the economic perspective, but also the political perspective, I see a few that are the ones that are helping always in the region, which is Argentina, Brazil, Chile. Now they are happy with this new boom of copper and lithium, but that won't be happening in other countries like Ecuador, Colombia, or Bolivia, right? But that will depend on who will be leading those countries. Right now in Brazil is, again, the left with Lula, but we don't know how Lula will be negotiating those with Argentina. We don't know the role of Bolivia yet, or the Chile. But it will be this southern part of the region that will be leading, because they are these major big countries leading the economic development rather than the other ones.
Okay.
So thank you very much.
Thank you again so much. Sofía, thank you for being with us and having a really rich perspective on the issue and the ideas from someone who is coming from there, which is absolutely invaluable. Hey, some things coming up. Reminder, next week we have Jeff Miser, who is going to talk about energy geopolitics, and then the follow-up, diving into the decisions, which I encourage all of you to be part of. The other thing is, would you like to help us out in the future to see what kind of a really, really awesome 72, 73-year-old organization we can continue to be? We are looking for a strategic planning consultant. We're looking for an education consultant to really think about our impact and how we do what we do. And if you get in touch with us, we can forward on. It was actually in our e-news this week. But if you know somebody and you think that they are amazing and we should know about them, send them our way. The other thing I'd like to do is thank Portland State. Portland State has been a partner with us on this program for many years. I said this last week. Great Decisions is 70 years old this year. It started in 1953 at this little thing called Vanport College with the World Affairs Council of Oregon. And it is nice to celebrate 70 years of changing people's minds. So, and this year's series is also brought to you not only by Portland State University, but by Kathy Moyd, a wonderful member who thinks that everyone should experience the program and should experience it more widely. So her generous support has been able to make this room out there in the ether and everything possible in part. So big hand for all of you for being here. We'll see you next week. And thank you again to Sofía Castellanos.
Oh, yeah.